Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to the November 2024 installment of Idaho Department of Labor's Labor Market Insight Series. As everyone's getting logged in and we're getting started, we'll just do a quick LMI update. And our most recent data for September 2024 shows that Idaho's seasonally adjusted unemployment rate was at 3.6%, which is up from 3.5% in August. The labor force participation, employment and unemployment all increased as Idaho added 5,800 payroll jobs, which was a 0.7% over the month increase, which was also the highest percentage increase in the nation for September. October's figures will be released this Friday, so stay tuned and check back with us as we update Idaho's economy up to October. My name is Craig Shaul. I'm the Labor Market Research Supervisor here at the department and your host. Today we'll be discussing some of the results from our 2024 Idaho Employer Climate Survey, or Idaho Business Climate Survey. This is our second edition after our inaugural survey last year for 2023. Joining me today are three of our labor economists. First, we have our primary economist that has been leading this project for this year is Seth Harrington. He's working out of our Twin Falls office and covering our South Central area. Like I said, he's the lead on the 2024 survey project and the primary analyst for the information you're about to hear. Lisa Grigg is also joining him to provide a conversation on today's results. She's our labor economist covering North Central Idaho from our Lewiston office. And we have a new face for you, Brandon Duong from our Pocatello office. Excuse me, it's Brandon Young. That's the way you pronounce it. Pardon me, Brandon. He's at our Pocatello office covering Idaho's southeastern region. Like last year's webinar for the Business Climate Survey, we'll be having a discussion among the three economists primarily. I'll just be the moderator and provide questions as the audience sends them in. I want to shout out to Idaho's Launch program. Launch is Idaho's trailblazing new approach to ensuring Idaho students stay in Idaho to fill rewarding, good-paying, in-demand jobs. Launch covers 80% of the cost up to $8,000 for an Idaho graduating high school senior to enter an Idaho-based workforce training or education program linked to an in-demand career. Round 2 of Launch applications open on October 1st. And there are more than 5,100 students that have started their applications already. If you like more information or have any students that would like to sign up, please go to nextsteps.idaho.gov/launch. And with that, I'll turn this over to Seth so he can kind of get started on the webinar and the conversation between him and Lisa and Brandon. Seth, what's going on?
Yeah, thanks, Craig, and thanks, Lisa and Brandon, for being on the panel so we can have some better, more informed discussions on the findings. Before we dive into the findings of the survey, I just want to briefly talk a little bit about the goals of the survey and also a little bit about some changes from last year. So this survey was really designed coming out of the pandemic. We saw really rapid change in Idaho's workforce and economy, and lots of questions we were being asked by employers were questions that if we had data, it was on a significant enough lag we really couldn't answer, or questions we really didn't have much data for at all. And so we decided to create this survey to not only provide some answers and some data to those questions, but it also helps us create a sort of like a barometer or a pulse check on how Idaho employers are feeling. And this survey the goal is to produce the survey fairly regularly, and so this can be a fairly regular pulse check on Idaho's businesses. Last year, being the first year of the survey, we sent out survey emails to almost every single employer in our contact list. It's over 100,000 employers. We heard back from a little over 2,300 employers, giving us a response rate of around 2.3%. This year, we decided to switch it up. We took a little bit more of a surgical approach. Instead of just trying to shoot it out to as many businesses as possible, we collected a survey sample of 5,000 randomly sampled businesses with an industry makeup that's proportional to Idaho overall. So essentially, we took a look at Idaho's overall industry makeup and then shrunk it to 5,000 businesses that were randomly chosen. We heard back from 371 businesses this year. That gives us a response rate of 7.4%. While that response rate is a lot better than last year, due to the survey sample being significantly smaller, we really can't dive in super deep on regions or industries this year. This survey data is really best viewed as a top-down look at the business climate of this state as a whole. With that, we'll start diving into some of our findings. I want to first illustrate what industries were over and undersampled in the survey results. So this light blue bar is looking at the percentage of respondents by industry, and the dark blue bar is looking at the overall sample, again, which is a proportional to the industry makeup of the state. And if we look here, we can look at some of these industries are overrepresented in the sample. For example, retail, trade, other services, and manufacturing. We also had many industries be undersampled. Industries like wholesale trade, public administration, and professional services, to name a few. This really illustrates why we weigh survey sample data. So the goal here, by weighing the survey, we're creating a slightly less emphasis on those industries that were oversampled and creating slightly more, weighing more emphasis on those industries that were undersampled. That way, the survey data results look a little more representative of the sample, which again is representative of the state's industries as a whole. And so we're really just trying to get the responses to look a little more like the industries overall. Moving on, starting with where industries, where respondents are operating in Idaho, broken up by region. I think pretty unsurprisingly, a vast majority of respondents were located in the southwestern region of the state. It's not only the largest region of the state by population, but it's really kind of the economic center of gravity here for the state of Idaho, and therefore has the most respondents. I think also interesting to note, multi-region respondents, or respondents that have are operating in multiple regions, were also a significant part of the sample this year. In fact, a quite larger sample than they were last year. And so we'll have a little bit more industries looking, or respondents looking at multiple industries across the state, or multiple regions, sorry. We also sampled for ownership structure. So this is looking at respondents, the ownership structure of the respondents. 94% of respondents were privately owned entities, with 6% being public or state-owned entities. So this survey is mostly looking at private business. However, there are some entities that are public sector. This is pretty similar to last year. I think last year we had 95% of respondents in private and 5% in public. So this ownership structure looks fairly similar to how they did last year. Any questions or insights from other panelists?
I was just going to add in here that we are the Department of Labor, and we pretty much cover employers that have employees, but this survey was not necessarily aimed at just those businesses with employees. You can see the proprietorships and the partnerships sitting in here is actually a large portion of our respondents. And some of them may not actually have any employees. It may be the owners running the businesses. So some of the questions may not really have applied to them, but I still think it's excellent that they responded, because there are other questions that we can still gain insight from on the economics of Idaho. So thank you for participating, everyone.
Exactly, yes. We aren't just looking at large businesses. We tried to sample from the breadth of solely home proprietorships to multinational companies, really trying to get the breadth of businesses in the state. So with those high level indicators out of the way, we'll dive into the meat and potatoes of the survey. We'll start with top business concerns. And again, this year, the best part of this year is we get to have a little bit of a year-over-year comparison on some of these indicators. Last year being the first year, we really just had the current year to look on, and now we can kind of look at some narratives that we've seen and really relay those to the previous year. I think what's just to start off, pretty unsurprisingly, labor concerns, whether it be high labor turnover in the dark blue or supply or cost of workers in the yellow, were the largest concerns this year as well, similar to last year. Pretty unsurprising. We've been hearing about labor concerns for quite a while, and that trend is continuing into 2024. What I did find a bit interesting is the dark green slice, the supply or cost of non-labor inputs. That slice declined fairly significantly from 2023 to 2024. I understand that inflation is fairly normalized now outside of real estate or housing, but it's something that just because prices are beginning to normalize, it's still a concern I hear all the time. Almost every presentation or meeting we do, inflation's brought up. And it was quite a common concern listed in other parts of the survey. And so I'm a bit surprised to see it decline as much as it did. Outside of that, taxes, regulations, and other public policies, that is the gray slice, and economic uncertainty in the black, have both grown over the year. And I think that does make a bit of sense. This survey was done in August this year, which is right before the first cut in the interest rates. That was in September. And then we had another one this past week. But before then, we really didn't know exactly what those cuts were going to look like and when they were going to happen. And so there's a lot of uncertainty in the air about when that would start. And so I think it makes sense that economic uncertainty is that high. It's also an election year. And so I think that in general creates uncertainty for businesses and consumers as well. And so I think this year there was a lot more kind of external factors that could create some uncertainty than the previous year. And with that, I'll pass it over to the panel if they have any questions or insights.
The actual low amount of inflation, like you mentioned, really surprised me. When you look on the national surveys and things, inflation stands out as being one of the top operating concerns of a lot of businesses this year. And to see it decline in actually a really small portion was shocking amongst Idaho. But when you combine those external factors like you were talking about, Seth, that declining demand and your taxes and your economic uncertainty, these are kind of your black, your dark grays, and your blues. We went from about 30% of businesses reporting this as their top concern to 40% this year. And I think that is a sizable and noticeable difference. That maybe supply constraint is starting to ease a little bit. It's still a problem, but perhaps it's starting to ease a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think the changes we're seeing generally here aren't super drastic, just these slow shifts that we've been hearing about kind of over the year manifesting here in the survey data. We can also break down these concerns by industry here. And so we've broken down those same concerns on the previous chart, broken up by industry. Before we dive in, I will note there is a miscellaneous bin here. This bin exists because we have a couple industries here that were only have maybe one or two respondents, and we want to protect their data and not disclose anything. Therefore, we've created this bin to bin some of those small, very undersampled industries, so we can still present some data, but not create any confidentiality issues. So that bin contains the administrative support and waste management industry, information management of companies and enterprises, mining, and public administration and wholesale trade. So those together are binned into that miscellaneous category. And again, reflecting what we saw in the previous graph, if we look at the dark blue and the yellow being high labor turnover and the supplier cost of workers, that is a significant top concern, right? Labor in a vast majority of our industries. A couple that are a little more exempt from that near the bottom there, professional technical services, finance and insurance, real estate, rental, and leasing. We'll get into finance and insurance and professional services a bit later when we talk about work arrangements. I think that illustrates some reason why those industries are seeing a slightly easier time with labor concerns. Real estate, rental, leasing, I think makes a lot of sense. The housing market has been pretty slow for a while. Demand is quite slow there as well. And therefore, we're not seeing huge jumps in the demand for employment in real estate. Looking at a couple other of our concerns here, Supplier cost of non-labor inputs, that's the dark green, was most prominent in transportation and warehousing. Again, I think that makes a lot of sense. Energy concerns with two geopolitical conflicts over the past year, really tying with energy costs and those being in flux, I think is definitely going to be a big concern for those transporting and storing goods and services. Declining demand, that is the light blue slice, was most prominent in arts, entertainment, and recreation, and also in real estate. Again, we've been hearing that, unemployment has been creeping up. The economy is beginning to slow. And so many households and consumers need to pull back on some of their non-essential spending. And that would really be anything in arts, entertainment, recreation really would be non-essential expenses. And again, with housing, it's been a really slow housing market. And so declining demand there makes a lot of sense. And then lastly, economic uncertainty. Again, that's our black bar there, was most prominent in real estate and finance and insurance. Two industries that really are quite speculative, like information and like long-term consistency, which right now is something we are not experiencing. And so I think those also make a lot of sense to be large concerns for those industries as, again, interest rates and election year and those things can really change how those industries need to adapt in the future. And so with that, I'll pass it over to the panel with any questions or insights.
I was going to say that it doesn't surprise me that healthcare is on the top. So healthcare is our #1 employment industry in the state of Idaho. It is also one of the fastest growing industries that we're seeing. We have a constant need for people. It also has one of the highest turnover rates when you look national level. And so there's a constant need for people, and nurses stand out as often being the top occupation by job postings when we're looking at it. And even putting Idaho Launch in there, the top degree program that people were pursuing for launch this year was nursing. And so we can't satiate the need with a growing population, but also an aging population. Healthcare is incredibly important, and we just can't seem to get enough bodies. Brandon, you got anything?
Yeah, I would just say that I think Seth really hit the nail on the head here with economic uncertainty being at the forefront of the concerns among finance and real estate, being like the front lines of the ever-changing economic landscape, and with interest rates heavily affecting these industries, it's absolutely no surprise to me that those would be really representative.
Yeah, and I think Lisa makes a great point. Those, especially those top three industries, if we look at the top of the graph here, where labor is the most, the strongest concern, healthcare, construction, education, those are all industries that, especially healthcare and construction, I think I could confidently say for every region of our state, we couldn't get enough nurses, and construction employment are just really, really top occupations or in-demand occupations across the state. So all of those are really industries we really can't get enough of, and that shows really in our monthly labor data as well. We'll move on now to top reasons for employee turnover. Again, this was especially relevant during the pandemic. We had the Great Resignation, tons of employees hopping jobs pretty quickly. And we wanted to get a more granular look at why employees are turning over, because at the end of the day, we are looking at individuals here. And so by getting a more granular look, we can kind of discern with greater insight why where employees are turning over and from what. Couple things I want to note here, starting off with retirement, that's the dark blue. Retirements did grow over the year to 2024. And I think that also makes a lot of sense. Lisa mentioned on the previous slide, talking about demographics and aging demographics, creating a greater need for healthcare, that also speeds up retirements. And so we're not surprised with the current demographic trends and information we have that retirements are a growing reason for employee turnover. If you want a deeper dive into that, Sam Wolkenhauer did a great webinar on our YouTube channel about aging demographics and labor force. So I'd recommend checking that out if you're interested. And then again, the lion's share here of employee turnover is concentrated in the light blue, which is employees quitting to work a similar job at another business, and in the gray, an employee quitting to work a different job at another business. So job hopping and job switching is still very relevant as it was in 2023. In fact, the light blue, employees quitting to work a similar job at another business, grew. So we are still seeing job hopping and job poaching. We did mention that also was mentioned in a couple of our surveys and our feedback that was a significant factor in their employment situation. But overall, these graphs look fairly similar year over year. I think the last thing I want to note is the brown slice, the other slice shrunk pretty substantially over the year, which to me indicates that 2024, at least for our team developing the survey with these reasons that we developed, estimated 2024 better than 2023. It looks like in 2023, there was a lot more reasons and things we didn't necessarily capture within the survey that we did a better job of this year. Looks like it was a little more predictable this year than it was last year. And with that, I'll pass over some time to the panel for insight.
I think the small jump in discharges and terminations really speaks to the slightly slackening labor market. We came from a really tight labor market in prior years, and as employment starts to tick up and we reach a more natural rate of unemployment, I think that employers are now more willing to assess their current labor force and maybe take a look at individuals who might be underperforming. Whereas before, getting closer to the pandemic, employers were just happy to get practically anyone as long as you were doing the job in any capacity, where now I think this is opening up to a lot of extra room for more discerning hiring practices in general.
And I just wanted to add one point that if you take away the reasons why employees quit when they don't rejoin the labor force, so we're talking about retirement, education, health, if you take the rest of those pie graphs, it's still about 70% of reasons why employees quit, they actually still remain in the labor force. And I think that's a really important point too, is that you hear about terms like the great resignation, but you also don't hear about the great hiring that happens after that there's just so much labor mobility that's happened. But I still just want to point out that, more than 2 out of every 3, depending on what other is, but still more out of 2 out of every 3 labor participants that quit a job, take another job and remain in the labor force. So I just wanted to point that out.
That's a great point, Lisa. Craig, you had a question.
Actually, we have a question that kind of tails off of what Lisa was saying, but we have 2 questions to kind of get at the same thing, which is for top reasons of employee turnover. It stated that the top reason employee quit to work a different job in another business. But why? Is it more pay or better benefits? I mean, was there anything in the survey that gets that, or anything we can speak to? And the second question that's similar, was salary an indicator why employees were leaving their same jobs at another business to get one, or to take a job at another business, or a different job at the same business? Yeah, I guess, is there any more information on that particular nuance of the response?
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't really have any detailed information on why the employees quit. That's definitely a good insight we could potentially add in future iterations of the survey. I would imagine wages is a significant one. It was during the pandemic. Wages was a significant factor in a lot of the job hopping that occurred when employers were kind of fighting for talent. So I would be surprised if that wasn't a significant factor, but unfortunately, we don't have a very detailed look at specific reasons employees were quitting to work at another business.
Can I just add something onto that, Seth? So we didn't ask why in this question. We didn't ask why, but reading some of the comments that people left, some of them were that employees were wage shopping, and that if they had a chance to work at a higher wage, they would take that job. And that goes back to that labor mobility option of employers realizing that there's a limited labor force out there, and there's been a lot more opportunity than lately. I mean, our job postings are still up, 50% over 2019, even though we're seeing a decline. 2022, we had almost 3 job postings per unemployed person, and it was incredibly difficult. But kind of national anecdotes, again, are the only way that employees have beat inflation are those who actually change jobs. And unfortunately, that's a painful thing that happens with an inflationary environment like we're in as well, is that in order to stay ahead of the curve, sometimes it takes drastic measures. But I think it was also just the supply and demand of labor were incredibly imbalanced. And we're starting to see that normalize, but there's still some very significant imbalances happening in the economy.
Definitely. And we do know that it's not all wage, especially kind of on the national level. And so when we talk about work arrangements a little bit later in the webinar, I think there's some compelling insight there as well, in regards to employees quitting to work a different job. So with that, we also looked at assessing current worker skills. So this graph is looking at the percent of employers who report that the skills current level is adequate for their needs. And so I specifically really want to look at that orange bar, which is looking at less than 1/3 are reporting the current level is adequate. That to me screams that there's a significant need in the now for these skills. And at the top of this list, it's actually a pretty good mix of soft skills like supervisor, managerial, leadership skills, and time management, mixed with some more technical skills like advanced computer software skills and job-specific English. We did add an advanced computer software skills skill this year. Last year, all we had were basic computer software skills, which we deemed as things like Microsoft Office, Zoom, and email, where advanced computer software skills would be like industry or company-specific software, AI tools, any programming, things like that. So we had a pretty healthy mix at the top here of technical skills, but also generalized soft skills with the current need. Any insights or comments from the panel?
Something that really surprised me with this was the amount of people who responded that job-specific English was not needed. I think one of the ways that we interpreted that result was of job-specific English is that related a lot to the type of corporate vernacular that companies employ, like, just like we were talking about acronyms and stuff like that. So I think that was one of the emphasis that we placed on that.
Yeah, it looks like corporate jargon. A lot of employers didn't see that skill needed, but the ones that did really needed to see that grow. I think that's an interesting point you make, Brandon, where a lot of that bar is blue, meaning the skill wasn't needed. But of the ones who need it, they see significant deficiency in that skill. That's a good insight. We also looked at the expected need for skills. So we asked employers of that same previous list of skills, how they expected that demand to change over the next 5 years. So we're trying to create a little bit of a projection for the need of these skills. And unlike the previous graph where we saw the present demand being a decent mix of technical, more specialized skills and kind of general soft skills, the expected need is really homogenized in soft skills. So these graphs look very similar year over year. And in fact, the top 5 is practically identical with soft skills like time management, teamwork, work ethic, leadership skills, really expecting those needs to grow. Not that specialized or technical skills aren't important. It's just if we look at the overall demand for skills, soft skills, people skills, we expect those needs to continue to grow, which I think makes a lot of sense. Not every single employee or employer is looking for an employee with advanced computer software skills or tool machine operation, but they'd all love one who has a great work ethic and good time management. Those are really great at any occupation or any industry you work in. Any insights or comments from the panel?
I was just going to add that you just mentioned work ethic, and that was something that was commented on multiple times in the spots where people could fill in. And it was just kind of trying to find also that fit of just the right person, but maybe they don't have all the skills, but maybe they can be coachable and trained. That was another side of that. Maybe they don't have all of them, but also takes that right personality to actually want to grow and be coachable. And that's something that employers were definitely seeking as well.
Definitely. We saw that a lot during the pandemic, especially when we just didn't have enough, talent. A lot of employers, especially more creative employers, would find someone who has the aptitude or the mindset to develop those skills and decided to train from there. We saw that in the previous last year's survey as well. So it looks like if you can't find the skills, but you can find someone who's really good at who has an aptitude to cultivate those efficiently, that could work as well for your needs. Moving on, we also looked at the employee work arrangements. We mentioned this a little bit earlier in the presentation, especially again, a lot of these questions we had really came out of the pandemic where remote and hybrid work really exploded kind of overall into the mainstream. And so we wanted to track how that is evolving and changing here in the state. And I think this graph is also pretty unsurprising. Jobs that really require you're mostly at a computer all day, or you're mostly it doesn't require you to be on site, are a lot easier to do remote or hybrid. So finance, insurance, professional services, where things like retail, trade, manufacturing, healthcare, really, for the most part, you need to be on site to complete the duties of your job. And like I mentioned before, earlier in the presentation, when we were looking at we looked at finance and insurance and professional services as two industries where not that labor issues weren't a problem at all, but they were below 30%, I think even below 20% in a couple instances, where the other industries saw labor concerns being 40 to 50% of their top concern. I think because these arrangements are inherently more flexible, it provides them a greater basket of potential applicants than the requirement the requirement that many of these industries have, where you need to be on site for the most part. I think that's a superpower in their in the ability for them to attract and retain employment. Any other insights or comments from the panel?
I was just going to add in that we've also talked about income levels of industries, and that's important to note too, and that finance and insurance and professional, scientific, and technical have some of the highest paying average wages as well in the economy. When you look at the bottom, accommodation and food services really sits down there on the bottom as well. And so much higher turnover, again, as well in that. But I also looking at the responses as to why jobs went unfilled. A lot of these in the top two, the finance and insurance, professional, scientific, was more a problem of poorly qualified applicants versus too few, which is kind of what we see in retail, manufacturing, and accommodation. And so it's even though they still may not have enough, the reasons they feel like they may not have their jobs filled are seeming to be slightly different. And so I think that it's a whole combination of potential flexibility, but also income levels and more of a career path probably on some of them as well. But multiple factors. But I do want to say that, I think there's probably, even though this doesn't show it, that almost every industry at least has a role that it likely could be done remote or hybrid, but it takes the right role and it takes that right person to really be able to pull it off successfully and productively, I think.
Agreed. I think that's important to note as well, that those, yes, they are generally have higher barriers to entry in finance and insurance or professional service jobs, and along with higher wages. Definitely important to note.
Real quick, I just wanted
Yes.
to note on this graph, I really liked how close our miscellaneous category was to all industries. I think that shows that it's not just blue collar or white collar that gets rolled into the miscellaneous, where we didn't necessarily have all the sample that we would have wanted, but it just shows that we're still getting a lot of good data when we look at the big picture and combine everything. That miscellaneous is still going to be giving us a lot of good insights into the Idaho economy.
Yeah, definitely. Continuing to talk about work arrangements, this is specifically looking at the all industries tab. That was about in the center bar in the previous graph. Just looking kind of at the state as a whole. Again, nationally, we have seen the trend to pull back, especially fully remote work in favor of hybrid. We've seen a lot of large companies really try to push for returns to office in some way, shape, or form. And so we wanted to kind of track that here in the state. These numbers, I think, validate that hypothesis. We do see a slight growth in in-person work. We see an expansion in hybrid, that's in the gray, and some decline in fully remote work. So it looks like that trend is manifesting here in Idaho as well. I do think it's important to note, though, that Idaho is definitely more of a blue-collar economy. We have a greater share of in-person work than the national level. So for example, the census produces the current population survey that predicts some of these statistics for us. So on the national level for 2023, it was by 80% in person, 9.6% hybrid, and 10.4% remote. So where Idaho has roughly 90% in person and 10% in a more flexible work arrangement, the national level is about 80% in person and 20% in a more flexible arrangement. And so it looks like we are following the national trends in the sense that we are seeing more hybrid and less remote, but we still are a unique enough economy where we definitely have a greater share of in-person employment than the national level. Any insights or comments from the panel? All right, and that concludes my portion of the survey findings. So I am now going to pass it over to Brandon to look at some information regarding employment expectations from employers. Oh, it's all yours, Brandon.
Thank you, Seth. I think something that's really important to look at that we did gauge in this survey was employment expectations. Expectations are particularly important because it gives us a little bit of a gauge of how employers are feeling about the current state of the economy. And also, I think it gives us a little bit of insight into maybe their policy going forward. For instance, if an employer is expecting that they're going to be having enough revenue to increase employment, it should theoretically be reflected in this survey. Whereas if they're feeling a little bit more uncertain, I think that would also be reflected in the results. So one of the questions that we asked was what they think future employment will look like. And we gave them 3 options. One of the options was employment will grow, it'll stay the same, and finally, it will shrink. Between our 2 surveys that we put out in 23 and this year, we had a slight shrinking of the number of respondents who said that employment will grow, as well as a little bit of 4% increase for people who thought employment was going to stay about the same, and additionally a 2% increase in respondents who thought that employment was going to shrink. Seth talked about it initially, I think, and a point he brought up was great, is this survey came in a time of a lot of economic uncertainty. I think this was just before the Federal Reserve released its interest rate target, and there's a lot of questions on what was going to happen with that, as well as, like you said, an election year. So I think a lot of that is what's captured here, but we're going to get into some really interesting findings in the next slide too, as far as the demographics of exactly what industry were represented for sort of this, what I call a pessimistic and optimistic view. But real quickly on this slide, do we have any questions?
I was just going to say that I think that this really shows a lot of optimism in Idaho. So if you consider combining employment will neither grow or shrink, so it's going to stay flat or it's going to raise, you have a 90% of businesses responding that they think that employment will do the opposite of declining. And so Idaho is leading the nation in population growth. We're leading the nation in employment growth. The number of businesses that have established themselves and started operations in Idaho has been huge the last couple of years. And I think there's just that a lot of industries are feeling that momentum, and that I could only even see 3 industries that were under 90% of this optimism, and it was transportation, warehousing, education, and real estate, and even they were 70% or so. So overall, there's a lot of optimism within spread throughout Idaho's industries and economies.
Absolutely, Lisa.
I think that's a great point. I think these graphs really illustrate, I think a lot of times I've been presenting recently, it's been showing that the economy is slowing, inflation or unemployment is rising. But in the context of our state and what's happening, expectations may be a little more tempered than they were last year. But yeah, the economy is doing great. Employers overall are feeling pretty confident. We may just be regulating to maybe a more new normal coming out of the pandemic, but expectations are good, and most employers are very confident about our economy, and I think that's important.
Absolutely. So on the next slide, we see of just that 11% of pessimists, a huge representation of education and finance. Those who thought employment was going to shrink in the coming years were in education and finance. And going back to our top concern slide, that makes a lot of sense because finance was really on the forefront, as we were saying, of the change in interest rates that the Federal Reserve was releasing at the time of release. So absolutely, that makes total sense. And education had a lot of just general employment concerns of meeting their total employment requirements. So it makes a lot of sense there. But I'd also like to point out that among those 11% who were pessimists with construction, healthcare, education, and finance, those same four industries were also the most optimistic. So about 27% of optimistic respondents were in construction, 17 in healthcare, 13 in education, and 9 in finance. So there's still plenty of optimism to be had in our current labor market outlook, I'd say. So I think we're still looking very good, and we might just be seeing a little bit of ambivalence due to a tempering of expectations following this really a pandemic high as we're starting to surge and all come back to work. So any comments or questions?
I just wanted to add in that it's not so shocking to see these industries both on a pessimistic side and an optimistic side. Some things are out of their control. Education, for instance, maybe a school passed their levy and maybe a different school that responded didn't. And so you're going to have very differing views of what's going to happen in the next 5 years based on your financial situation. But what I really did appreciate about this was when you look at your pessimists, your other industries outside of these main four represent a really, really small 3% slice of that pie. When you go to the optimist side, they're a third. And so there's a lot more diversity in your optimism side than your pessimism side. And again, that kind of weighs to your last chart, Brandon, of just showing how optimistic these industries are in Idaho based on what we've gone through the last couple of years and what we see. Often, recent patterns are gonna guide what you expect to happen the next few years. If you're expecting the same kind of status quo, it's not surprising that there's more optimism in general than pessimism here.
Absolutely, Lisa. And I'd be so excited to see these results if they were taken again today, especially in education, given a lot of the levies in Idaho were passed too. So I think something that changes is people's opinion, but something that's just locked in time is this little snapshot that we have. But I think it still has a ton of insight.
All right. Thank you so much, Brandon. And now we'll pass it over to Lisa. She has some interesting findings on some job openings data we have. So I'll pass it over to her.
Okay, thank you, Seth. So I wanted to look quickly at, we've talked about this really tight labor market that we've gone through. And so just wanted to kind of highlight some of the questions that asked employers. Do you have jobs open? Are you having trouble filling those jobs? Why do you think those jobs are going unfilled? How many jobs do you have that are unfilled that are over 30 days old? And so just as a comparison, you can see that we actually had about the same share of businesses that still had a job posting out there. But when you go in the middle of the screen here, percent of total job postings that were not filled within 30 days, you can actually see we actually cut that almost in half versus last year. And that kind of goes in step with what we're seeing of not only job postings are declining a little bit, but just the labor mobility is declining as well. You're not seeing people really able to job hop as much as they were because there's just slightly slimmer opportunities than there were the year before. But I think also, we've been increasing our unemployment levels slightly. And so there's a bigger pool of people out there that are willing and ready to work that maybe weren't in the market last year. And I think that's an important note. And then on the far side, the percent of businesses with active postings where at least one of them were still unfilled after 30 days. So we did see a decline. It's a very small decline. And I think that still goes to the point that, we talk about easing and we talk about it's not the record tight labor market we had in 22 and 23, but it's still a very tight labor market and it's still very competitive out there. And I just wanted to point that out that employers, there's a limited supply of people that are out there looking for jobs and you kind of have to put your best foot forward and really you kind of have to kind of fight for some of those really good employees because there's still not a ton of those people out there who are that are not currently employed. But we did see overall some softening. happening. And I think that's a positive thing. It feels a little less chaotic than it did this time last year. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Seth to conclude us.
Perfect. Thanks, Lisa. So to kind of in one slide quickly wrap up kind of overarching themes we've been talking about today. Labor has begun to, as Lisa mentioned in the previous slide, we've seen some softening. We're nowhere near kind of the highs of 22 and 23, but top business concerns still are predominantly labor concerns. I think important, the significant change this year, we saw growth in taxes, regulations, other public policies, and overall economic uncertainty were rising concerns this year. Top reasons for employee turnover, similar to last year, are still centered around employees switching jobs. However, retirement is a growing factor as in employee turnover as the workforce continues to age and our overall population demographics continue to trend that way. Soft skills are still projected to have the largest demand over the next 5 years. Remote work has also been pulled back in favor of more hybrid work arrangements. And employers are still very optimistic, but it looks like expectations are a little more tempered this year than they were in 2023. Less job openings unfilled after 30 days as the economy has slowed from 2023. Many concerns this year really are external concerns compared to more internal concerns last year. It looks like a lot of concerns this year were involved in retirement, economic uncertainty, interest rates, mortgage rates. It's an election year. We had a lot of that. Some of that is kind of a sign of when the snapshot was taken before interest rates began to be cut. But I think overall, there's a lot more just generalized uncertainty over kind of the overall economy compared to more specialized in certain industries compared to last year. Any final words or thoughts from the panel? All right, and with that, that concludes our presentation. We have our contact info below, and we can open the floor for some questions.
All right, thank you, Seth, Lisa, and Brandon. Nice job. I think that's been it's great, very interesting to see what the survey provided. I think it did a good job of it. I have some questions, but we first we'll get to questions from the audience, and I'll just say for anyone that is looking to ask questions, please feel free to throw it in there in the Q&A at the bottom. The question we have from the audience is looking at future projections. Does Idaho expect any extreme anything extreme to occur in the near future, and therefore we expect to see the retirement percentage of the people retiring, that percentage to go up, or any kind of big changes we expect to see in the economy that would be different or consistent with this?
I think the biggest one we feel pretty confident predicting is, yeah, the aging population trend will continue, and that's going to be kind of regardless of a pandemic kind of messing up supply chains, a shortage in labor due to those demographic transitions is going to be something that it's not just an Idaho problem, that's really a nation and most of the developed world problem. And that's something that employers the economy is just going to be better at accepting that we are going to see that transition. And it's going to be a fairly permanent one as demographics take a long time to it takes a lot longer for us to produce prime age workers. So that is going to be a long-term kind of demographic constraint on our workforce for sure.
So yeah, go ahead, Lisa. Looks like you're going to add to that.
I was just going to say that the baby boomers are a very big generation, and the youngest of them turned 60 this year. And so even if they're not retiring, they're thinking about it. They're starting to put things into play and considering what that path is going to look like. And the size of the labor force that is 16 and over that is potentially gaining the labor force is not that big. It's not as big as the one that we're losing. So there's going to be some very painful transition period. But I also just want to mention a couple of specific industries. So construction is one of those that we have big expectations for next years as far as demand. There's some major projects, not only the big housing backlog because of all of the people that came into Idaho, but there's a big commercial push. There's bridges and roads and infrastructure that's kind of getting outdated and having to be built to accommodate all these people. So construction is one of those industries that I say is probably a bit of a strange black horse for Idaho. You may not see it quite as strong in some other states, but given our situation, construction, I think, is going to be one of those that's going to need a lot of bodies over the next decade.
I'll mirror that with what Lisa said earlier. Healthcare is also, as our population ages, aging populations just require more healthcare. And so we would feel pretty confident in saying healthcare and construction are two that are going to see significant growth over the coming years, for sure.
Thank you, Lisa and Seth. Brandon, did you want to add anything to that, or?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say that healthcare absolutely makes sense, especially with Medicare and Medicaid. That would absolutely be our expectation that demand for health insurance should stay strong, if not perhaps grow.
All right, thanks, Brandon. All right, we have two questions that are kind of similar. I'll kind of frame them so we can answer them both at the same time. Basically, it's so what resources are available to businesses and companies to retrain workforce rather than perhaps see them quit or shed them, or whether they hope to recruit newly trained workers and the desired skill set, and combined with that, and something that our survey is certainly pointing out is that work ethic, or maybe the lack thereof, has been a kind of a chronic endemic problem. And it's certainly getting more of a problem, it seems. What resources are available to help provide that value training, the soft skill training for workers? Seth, I'll throw it to you first since you're leading this group, but what do you have for that?
I think a couple things. I think apprenticeships, especially that growing in the state, has been pretty critical, especially for young people. It's hard to learn those. You can learn those in the classroom, but I think having the more classroom soft skills in combination with more kind of real world on the job, those soft skills, getting those early, I think is really critical. So I think looking out for those apprenticeship programs and doing what you can to support those is a great idea. I also think we're talking about Idaho Launch. I think that's one of our cleanest ways we can provide efficient, affordable training. And so I think those are the two factors I can think of quickly that can really provide some of those training opportunities, especially for young people before they enter the labor force.
Just jumping off of that too, I think with the soft skills being in really high demand from our workforce, I almost think that one of our results was, which was the reduction in remote work, might also benefit the sort of development of soft skills, especially with people just entering the workforce, high school graduates and stuff. Just getting to have that one-on-one with their employer and their coworkers could really help to foster a lot of the collaboration that is required in the modern workforce.
I think you hit the nail on the head, Brandon. That's, I think, one of the biggest drivers of pulling back from full remote into hybrid is those collaboration and communication efforts. A lot of employers find those valuable. So I think you're onto something there for sure.
And I just wanted to kind of touch on the work ethic side of just when people feel engaged in what they do and they feel like they have some empowerment, I think that their levels of work ethic will actually increase as they feel that they have more skin in the game, essentially. And we're also just looking at that supervisory, managerial skills need. When you have a really tight labor market and you're short-staffed, it's very hard to actually mentor the next level, right? And so it kind of feeds its own problem because you're in such a rush and you're trying to keep your people from being burnt out, but you're short-staffed and you can't accomplish everything you wanted. And that it kind of, like I said, it feeds on itself. And sometimes that supervisory skills, those people you would be training up, you simply don't have the person there to spend that personal one-on-one time to actually help them gain some of those skills. And I think that was a problem that we did face the last couple of years that we're going to have to work through as far as onboarding employees and getting them on a track that leads to those supervisory skills and leadership skills as well.
Lisa, I'd also just like to add to that with our aging workforce too, which is, as Seth said, a national trend. There's going to be all the more emphasis on making sure that the sort of knowledge that's been gained from those older employees is passed down to the new hires and stuff. So absolutely, training is going to be important to maintaining our workforce quality.
Great, thank you for that. The next question is, what can we expect from the future of the health insurance market? Is the labor force expected to stay relatively healthy?
I don't think I have a ton of information on the health projections. So I don't think I can comment too much on this. I think overall, if we just look at age and aging populations, healthy or not, they require more medical assistance than younger people on the average. And so if what we're kind of predicting that greater demand in those sectors, along with a relatively smaller workforce, I think we can hope for innovations in the healthcare market to help accommodate those more efficiently.
I was just going to say that I maybe I'm misunderstanding the question, but I was thinking it was about health insurance marketplace. And I was just going to say that nationally, healthcare is the #1 expenditure of the U.S. and it's been increasing significantly. And it's going to be, that's why you hear talks about Medicaid of just what it's going to do, because it is the #1 expenditure. And when you have fewer people supporting it down below than those who are collecting it, it becomes an interesting issue to talk about, and it doesn't have an easy answer at all. And so unfortunately, it might be painful. I'll put it that way.
And then the final question is that we have, let's see if someone adds more as before ending. This is more not necessarily on the soft skill side, but more of the hard technical skills. What resources can motivate companies to retrain and invest in their existing workforce rather than lay off employees and hire new ones with specific technical skill sets, like you're saying, the hard skills, not the soft skills?
I think a lot of that can be broken down with communication and maybe even a lack of understanding that it's going to be more cost effective for you to train and employ within than hire and onboard someone outside, especially with technical skills. That onboarding can take a lot longer. And so I think the education of that and the understanding and communicating with your team of, who want, knowing the goals of your employees and where they want to end up, I think is also important in determining where and who should take on those roles. But I think it really comes down to communication and an understanding of the cost differences there.
I'd also just like to bring up what Craig brought up at the very beginning. We sort of talked about the Idaho Launch Program. I think that's going to be a huge benefit to employers with the sort of skill up that would offer to a lot of our students just coming out of high school. And I think that's going to do a lot to meet the demands of the current labor market.
And I'll just finish with an employer's reputation is important, and there's a lot more advertising that happens by word of mouth. So if that employer is laying off people and then hiring new ones, those who got laid off are probably going to be a little jilted, and the employer may actually have a hard time finding a lot of people in their local community. So I back to Seth's point of, if you can take that time and you have the people, but they can be retrained and you can take that effort, again, it may be less painful, and you may actually get the benefits of longevity, less turnover, and more engaged workers all at one time. So the answer is not easy, right? It's individual for every employer, but just realize that if you're having to lay off your employees that maybe have provided you service throughout many of their years and take a lot of pride in what they do, there may be some. It may not be too friendly on some of that other side.
Thanks, Lisa. And then we have one more question. I'll answer it, but the question is Idaho Launch still funded? Unless one of you have the exact amount, I'll just say that it has funded. I don't know the exact amount for this basically second round. So it's been funded for this year, and the new applications open on October 1. And statistics we have so far, over 5,100 students have already started the application for launch funding for the next round. So yes, but obviously that's I'm sure that'll be a topic of the legislature for this year. But it's certainly something that we kind of see results from our side in terms of that seems to be kind of helping enrollments and such like that. But one last question I have. I know we're at noon, but I just want to have one question for Seth real quick, since he's the lead analyst, and we kind of touched on that with some of the questions when we're talking about top concerns. Looks like we need to go one level deeper on that question in terms of why employees are leaving. But I was just curious for next year, what question would you want to add to the survey or topic that you would want to know more about for 2025?
It's a really good question. I think a deeper dive into employee turnover. I think I think previous questions brought a good point that like we mentioned, we're trying to get a more granular look at why employees are leaving. Saying they're going to a different business, while it's helpful, isn't super granular. And so I think a deeper look at why, and I think that's also something that will change more as time goes on. A lot of these are pretty evergreen. We expect retirements to keep growing, things like that. I think a more granular look at why they would go to a different business or a similar business would create interesting changes year over year. And so I think a deeper look there would be interesting.
Good. All right, Seth, well, thanks again. And since we're at 12:01, I will bring our webinar to a close and thank everyone for attending. I will just remind you that our final webinar for 2024 is scheduled for December 10th. Sam Wolkenauer will provide a narrative on the economic and labor force conditions as we close out the year and look forward to the next. Again, one final reminder about launch around, like I said, October 1, applications for round 2 started. 5,100 students have already started their applications. If you want to know more or have a student you want to connect with that, it's nextsteps.idaho.gov/launch. And then also the Department of Labor, Idaho Department of Labor has many free services, which include access to labor market information, which you can get to at lmi.idaho.gov. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for attending. Have a good day. Happy Thanksgiving, and let's be careful out there.